The stage lights burned hot against her skin, but Sophia Lane smiled anyway. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted her name, and a sea of flashbulbs turned her world into a blinding storm of adoration. She was the picture of success, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, celebrated, envied, unstoppable. But none of them knew. None of them saw the small, trembling hand inside the designer clutch, clutching a crumpled scrap of paper. None of them knew that, beneath the flawless makeup and the confident gaze, Sophia Lane was hiding a piece of herself so delicate, so fragile, that she feared it might shatter at the slightest touch. And tonight, of all nights, it was getting harder to keep it hidden. Sophia's driver pulled up to the entrance of a quiet, ivy-covered building tucked away from the glittering skyscrapers. A private program, Leaders in Literacy, designed to pair top executives with scholars for public speaking and communication enhancement. It was supposed to be a formality, a box to check, smile, pose, endorse. Instead, it would change everything. As she stepped inside, the lights dimmed behind her, replaced by the heavy, calming hush of old books and polished floors. And there, standing awkwardly near a large oak desk, was Henry Carter, a professor whose reputation for brilliance was second only to his reputation for being invisible. He looked up, startled, his glasses slipping down his nose. Sophia offered a dazzling, professional smile. Henry gave a stiff, almost fearful nod. Two people from two different worlds, thrown together for a reason neither of them could predict. As she moved closer, Sophia's hand brushed against the clutch. The crumpled paper inside seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, a poem, her own, written in secret during sleepless nights, a piece of herself she had promised would never see the light of day. But Henry Carter, without knowing, was about to find it. And when he did, everything Sophia Lane built would be questioned, not by the world, but by her own heart. Because sometimes the brightest lights hide the deepest shadows. And sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who fear being truly seen. Before the night when everything began to shift, Sophia Lane lived a life most people only dreamed of. Her morning started before dawn, the skyline outside her penthouse window still cloaked in a soft, velvety darkness. She would sit alone with a black coffee, scrolling through the day's agenda, meetings, board presentations, interviews, gala invitations. Her assistant, Marcy, would text updates before Sophia even asked for them, keeping the machinery of success oiled and invisible. Sophia liked it that way. Efficient, polished, untouchable. At the headquarters of Lane Industries, her presence was magnetic. She commanded rooms without raising her voice. When she entered, conversation shifted, spines straightened. People hungered for her approval, but rarely received it, and Sophia preferred it that way. Distance was safe. Distance meant no one would see the cracks. Underneath the luxury and accolades, there was another Sophia, a quiet girl who used to sit on her bedroom floor, scribbling verses in secret notebooks. Words were her first love, her first rebellion. But somewhere along the way, somewhere between her father's disappointed stares and the world's ruthless demands, she had buried that part of herself deep beneath ambition and duty. Poetry didn't fit on a resume. Feelings didn't sign million-dollar contracts. So Sophia taught herself to trade dreams for achievements, and with each corporate conquest, the fragile pieces of her soul were packed tighter and tighter inside her chest, silent and unseen. And it worked. At least it appeared to. During press conferences, she would smile brightly. During award ceremonies, she would offer rehearsed gratitude. During interviews, she would speak in crisp, decisive phrases that made investors lean forward eagerly. She had become an icon, a symbol of relentless success. But there were moments, small ones, that betrayed her. When she brushed her hand across an old bookstore's window and paused longer than necessary. when she stayed up at night, not reviewing spreadsheets, but quietly composing lines of poetry in the notes app of her phone, when she caught herself wishing just once someone might see the parts of her she had hidden so carefully and not turn away. Of course, that was foolish. In Sophia's world, weakness wasn't forgiven. Vulnerability was a liability. She knew that better than anyone. Still, the need to be known, truly known, flickered quietly in her chest, like a flame she didn't dare feed. That was the life Sophia Lane lived before Henry Carter. A life where success was measured by applause, where solitude was a shield, and where the deepest parts of her heart were locked away so tightly even she had started to forget how much they mattered. But as she stood in that quiet building, with the soft smell of parchment and dust in the air, and the unassuming professor blinking at her from across the room, something unfamiliar stirred inside her, something she had almost forgotten. The possibility of being seen. The partnership was supposed to be simple. Every Tuesday evening, Sophia Lane would meet Henry Carter in the small study room lined with dusty books and faded portraits of forgotten scholars. They would sit across from each other, discussing public speaking techniques, leadership language, and strategies to enhance Sophia's already formidable presence. At first, their conversations were formal, cautious. Henry spoke with clipped, precise sentences, his eyes rarely meeting hers. Sophia answered in smooth, measured tones, a professional mask firmly in place. But one evening, after an unusually long silence stretched between them, something shifted. Henry closed the workbook they were reviewing and leaned back slightly, his gaze finally meeting hers. His voice, when it came, was low and almost apologetic. "You speak perfectly, Sophia," he said, his thumb brushing against the edge of the table. "But when you do, it's like there's a wall between you and the words." Sophia stiffened, the professional mask tightening instinctively. "I don't understand," she replied, careful to keep her voice neutral. Henry hesitated, then continued. "It's polished, impressive, but it's not real." He spoke the word gently, almost regretfully. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had passed between them before. Sophia's hands tensed in her lap, her nails pressing crescents into her skin. Henry, flustered by her expression, reached for his notebook to change the subject, and in the movement, something else spilled from her bag, unnoticed until it was too late. A small, crumpled scrap of paper fluttered onto the floor. Henry bent instinctively to pick it up. Sophia's heart stopped when she realized what it was. Her poem, the one she had written a few nights ago, raw and unfinished, after a long, sleepless evening when success tasted bitter and loneliness gnawed at her edges. "Wait," she said sharply, standing up so quickly her chair screeched against the floor. But Henry had already seen it. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't make a sound. He simply looked at the delicate, trembling handwriting, the fragile beauty of words that spoke of fear, hope, and a longing to be understood. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to her, and in his eyes there was no ridicule, no judgment, only an aching kind of recognition. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. Henry Carter, the quiet, awkward professor, had glimpsed something no one else had ever been allowed to see. The real Sophia, hidden beneath layers of power and polish. And worst of all, he hadn't turned away. For the first time in years, the fortress she had built so carefully around her heart showed its first tiny crack. Sophia wanted to grab the paper, to destroy it, to erase the moment as if it had never happened. But she couldn't move. She could only stand there, exposed and trembling, as the wall between her and the world began, ever so slightly, to crumble. The following days unfolded like slow, heavy rain, soaking into Sophia's carefully constructed life in ways she couldn't ignore. Nothing had outwardly changed. At the office, her team still lined up outside her glass-walled office for approval. Investors still smiled eagerly at her, their eyes hungry for her nod. The media still praised her poise, her brilliance, her control. But inside, something had shifted irreversibly. Every time Sophia glanced at a mirror, she didn't just see the polished executive everyone else admired. She also saw the woman who had written trembling words on a crumpled paper, and the man who had seen them without recoiling. It should have been a small moment, easy to forget. Instead, it grew inside her like a vine, twisting through her ribs, touching places she had long silenced. The next Tuesday meeting was unbearable. Sophia arrived early, standing awkwardly near the shelves, pretending to study the spines of old books she had no intention of reading. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest when she heard Henry's quiet footsteps entering the room. He said nothing about the poem, and that silence, somehow, was worse than anything he could have spoken. Their lesson proceeded as if nothing had happened. Henry's voice was calm, his instructions precise. But Sophia wasn't listening. Every word he spoke felt distant, muffled by the roar of her own racing thoughts. Did he pity her now? Did he see her as weak, foolish? Worse, did he now know that behind her perfect speeches there was a deep well of uncertainty and longing? Sophia found herself fumbling words she would have once spoken effortlessly. She dropped her pen twice. She barely answered questions. Her mind, usually sharp as a blade, felt slow, heavy, betrayed by emotion. Henry noticed, of course, and as gently as he could, he closed his notebook and leaned forward. "You're allowed to have more inside you than people expect," he said softly. Sophia looked at him sharply, her throat tightening. She hated how kind he sounded, how dangerously close he came to seeing her, the real her. "I don't need pity," she said quickly, her voice harder than she intended. Henry didn't flinch. "I didn't say you did." For a long moment they sat there, locked in a silence that was fuller, heavier than any words could have been. Sophia rose abruptly, gathering her things. "I have meetings," she muttered. A lie. Henry simply nodded, watching her with that quiet, steady gaze that was somehow more disarming than any grand gesture would have been. As she left, the door clicked shut behind her, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Sophia Lane, queen of composure, was unraveling from the inside, and for the first time she wasn't sure she wanted to stop it. What scared her most wasn't the fear of being judged. It was the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that being seen, truly seen, might not destroy her after all. Sophia sat alone in her car long after the building's lights had dimmed, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The city pulsed around her, glittering towers, honking taxis, people bustling through neon-lit sidewalks. But inside the car, there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. All she had ever known was control. Control over her image, control over her success, control over her heart. Letting even a crack show was unthinkable. It was dangerous. And yet, there, in the quiet echoes of Henry's words, "You're allowed to have more inside you than people expect," something new and terrifying flickered inside her. Permission, not from the world, from herself. Sophia swallowed hard, resting her forehead against the steering wheel. She could keep pretending, of course. She could bury the moment, build higher walls, tighten her smile until it was bulletproof again. Or she could take the risk she had never dared to take. The decision didn't come like a lightning strike. It came slowly, painfully, like thawing ice cracking underfoot. That night, she didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove through the quiet streets until she reached a place she hadn't visited in years. A tiny bookstore tucked between two towering office buildings, so small it looked almost accidental. She pushed the door open. The familiar scent of old paper and worn wood wrapped around her like a memory. The owner, an old man with kind eyes, barely looked up as she entered. He remembered her, the sharp girl who used to sit cross-legged between the poetry aisles, lost in verses no one else valued. Sophia wandered through the narrow rows until she found the section she was looking for. poetry. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled a leather-bound journal from her bag. Her real journal, not the corporate planner she carried like armor. Inside it were dozens of poems, some only half-finished, others raw and bleeding across the pages. She chose one, the one that scared her the most. Without letting herself hesitate, she tucked it inside the cover of a slim poetry book and walked up to the counter. "I'd like to leave this here," she said, her voice almost breaking. The old man looked at her for a long moment, then simply nodded. No judgment, no questions. Sophia stepped outside into the cool night air, her heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out the sounds of the city. She had done it. A small, almost invisible act of rebellion against everything she had built her life around. A quiet surrender to the truth she had buried for too long. For the first time in years, Sophia Lane felt something she couldn't quite name. Not fear, not shame. Freedom. Tiny, fragile, but real. And in the quiet dark, beneath the indifferent stars, she allowed herself a small, trembling smile. The world didn't end because she let herself be seen. Maybe, just maybe, it was only beginning. Seasons shifted quietly around Sophia Lane, almost without her noticing. The days grew longer, then shorter again. The city's trees turned gold, then bare, then green once more. And within her, slow but sure, something continued to change. At work, she remained the CEO. Fierce, brilliant, respected. But those who paid close attention noticed subtle differences. Sophia smiled more often, and not just the practiced, press-perfect smile. She paused during meetings to really listen, her gaze softer, her posture less rigid. She began to speak less like a polished machine and more like a woman who had lived, who had lost, who had dreamed. At first, it unsettled those around her. People weren't sure what to make of a Sophia Lane who allowed space for vulnerability. But strangely, it didn't diminish her authority, it deepened it. Colleagues leaned in closer, drawn not just by her power, but by the authenticity beneath it. And outside of the corporate towers, in a life she once kept hidden even from herself, Sophia allowed herself small, sacred rebellions. She returned to the little bookstore every few weeks, always slipping a new poem into a random book when no one was looking. Sometimes she saw them, young women, older men, teenagers, discovering the hidden verses tucked inside worn pages. She never stayed to see their reactions. It was enough to know that someone, somewhere, had touched a piece of her truth. Her sessions with Henry continued, but they changed too. Their meetings, once strict and agenda-driven, became quieter, more fluid. They spoke of language, yes, but also of fear and dreams and the strange beauty of being human. Henry never brought up the poem he had seen. He never forced her to explain herself. Instead, he offered her a space where she could exist without needing to perform. And Sophia, in turn, found herself confiding in him in small, cautious bursts. Stories from her childhood, moments of doubt she had buried, hopes she had never dared name aloud. They laughed more too, real laughter, the kind that shakes loose something heavy inside you. Time passed, and the sharp, aching loneliness that had once been Sophia's constant companion began to fade into something gentler. Solitude, yes, but not emptiness. A life that was fuller, richer, even in its quietness. Holidays came and went. She spent some with colleagues, some with distant family members she had slowly begun to reconnect with. Sometimes she spent them alone, writing in her journal by the window while snow fell softly against the glass. And though she still wore designer suits and stood behind podiums, though she still signed contracts and led mergers, Sophia Lane no longer lived only in the polished, unyielding image the world demanded. She lived fully, fiercely, quietly, in all the hidden spaces between. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but real. And somehow that was more powerful than she had ever dared to believe. It was a rainy Thursday when the past returned. Sophia was reviewing a strategic merger proposal in her office when her assistant, Marcy, buzzed through. "There's a man here to see you," she said, hesitation coloring her voice. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." Sophia's first instinct was to decline. Her schedule was tight, and unplanned meetings were a disruption she rarely tolerated. But something, a whisper of instinct maybe, made her pause. "Send him in," she said quietly. A moment later the door swung open, and there he was. Henry, but not the Henry she remembered from the study rooms and late-night conversations. This Henry looked different, his clothes damp from the rain, his expression raw, unguarded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside blurred into meaningless motion, just rain against glass, just muted city noise. Inside the office, time held its breath. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Henry said finally, voice low, uncertain. Sophia stood slowly, heart hammering in her chest. What happened? Henry stepped forward, holding something in his hand, a small, worn book of poetry. Not the ones she had planted in the bookstore. This one was older, battered from years of use. He opened it carefully to a page near the middle. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. There, tucked between the pages, was another piece of her handwriting. A poem she had written months ago, long before she had ever met Henry. A poem she had abandoned in a library she used to visit during her college years, back when she was still trying to believe she could have a different life. "I found this," Henry said. "A few weeks ago, before we ever met, actually. I didn't realize it was yours, not until the day in the study room." Sophia's fingers trembled slightly as she reached out, touching the edge of the page, as if to convince herself it was real. "You wrote this before you became—" "All this," he said, gesturing gently to the empire she now ruled, "and it changed me." He closed the book carefully, cradling it like something fragile. "I kept it with me," he admitted, voice rough. "Not because I knew you, but because it made me feel less alone." Sophia pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the thunder of her heart. All this time, she had thought no one could truly see her. All this time, she had believed she had to hide to survive. And yet, even back then, when she was just a frightened girl with nothing but trembling words, someone had found her. And he had carried that piece of her with him, silently, faithfully, through the years. The tears came without warning, hot and unbidden. Sophia didn't wipe them away. Instead, she stepped forward and, for the first time in a very long time, allowed herself to be held. No walls, no armor, no fear. Just two people, battered by the world, finding each other again. Not in the polished perfection of their achievements, but in the raw, imperfect beauty of their truth. Life didn't transform overnight for Sophia Lane. There were no dramatic headlines, no grand speeches announcing her change. The world outside continued spinning at its relentless pace, meetings scheduled, deals negotiated, awards presented. But inside her, a quieter, far more significant revolution had taken place. Sophia learned that real strength wasn't measured by how high she could build her walls, but by how bravely she could open the doors she had long since bolted shut. Henry remained in her life, not as a mentor or subordinate, not as someone she had to impress, but as an equal, a fellow traveler on a road they both had feared to walk. They built something together that defied the polished definitions Sophia once clung to. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect ending, but a partnership rooted in honesty, patience, and a shared understanding that vulnerability was not weakness. It was the purest form of courage. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings when Sophia still hesitated before speaking her truth. Nights when old doubts whispered that she was too exposed, too soft. But now she had someone who could meet those fears with steady eyes and a simple truth. "You're not alone," And over time, Sophia realized she didn't have to hide her poetry anymore. She published a small collection under a pseudonym, not for fame, not for acclaim, but for herself, for the girl she had been, and for every other soul who had ever written their heart into hidden corners of the world, praying someone might one day find it. She continued leading her company, standing behind podiums, making decisions that shaped industries. But she also sat at kitchen tables, scribbling messy verses at midnight, walked in the rain without an umbrella, laughed loudly at jokes only Henry understood. Sophia Lane was no longer just the legend people admired from a distance. She was a woman fully alive, brilliant and bruised, polished and raw, powerful and tender all at once. And that, she realized, was the greatest success she could ever hope to achieve. Because life isn't about perfect images or flawless victories. It's about daring to be real, to risk being seen, and in doing so to find the connection we all secretly crave. Sophia had spent years building towers no one could climb. Now she built bridges instead. Fragile at first, trembling with the weight of every step, but strong enough to carry her forward, strong enough to carry others too. And as the seasons turned once more, Sophia Lane stood not as a woman armored against the world, but as one standing open to it. Arms wide, heart unhidden, ready for whatever came next. Because in the end, it wasn't perfection that made her unforgettable. It was her beautiful, unbreakable willingness to be seen. If you enjoyed Sophia's journey from fear to freedom, make sure to leave a like down below. What part of the story impacted you the most? Do you think it's easy or hard to let ourselves be truly seen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think, and if you've ever had a similar moment of self-discovery. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to stay updated with more stories like this, filled with real emotions and powerful transformations. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you next time.